Hi, this is the first video in a series of about 6 that we're going to do to take you through some of the basics of car setup and a few tips to help you race better. Things we're going to cover are pre-setup, then we're going to do suspension setup, tyres, electrics, so it's motor, ESC, lipos. Then we're going to go into body shell preparation and finally setup theory. So they're all going to be separate programs, and today we're going to go through pre-setup. Okay, so let's have a look at pre-setup. So there's a few things that you need to do with your car before you start doing all the suspension settings so that you can have a reliable setup and you're not working off any problems in the car that are going to disguise the setup and upset the balance of the car. So there's 2 main things that we're going to look at now, and the first one of those is tweak, and then the second one is getting the droop settings right, because if you don't get those 2 things right, all your settings are not going to be right after that point. So there's a few different ways of working out if you've got tweak in the car. And what tweak is, it's just a slight distortion in the chassis. It means that things aren't properly aligned, maybe a slight twisting in the chassis that's happened through tightening things up in the wrong sequence or maybe after a crash. And so it's really important to make sure there's no tweak in the car before you start setting it up. So let's have a look at different ways to work out if you've got tweak. So the first thing to do is turn the car over and just make sure that there's no screw heads sticking up. So make sure all these are nice and tight, and make sure none of these are sticking up over the chassis, or else they're going to confuse your judgment and the chassis won't sit flat on the flat surface. So we've got a nice flat surface here. It's a standard glass setup thing, and we're going to lay the car down and just see how it sits. So I've got a little stick here for checking for tweak, but you can use anything really, a wrench or a pen. So you just push down different parts of the car and see if it moves. So you can see there's a little bit of movement there, which is not good. Now, often what I do is I move the car off the board a little bit, just to see if this front bumper section is causing it to raise up, because sometimes this front section doesn't sit flush with the chassis, which can confuse your tweak judgment. So let's just move this forward off the board a little bit and try it again. So I can see now there's a tiny bit of movement, there's still a bit of tweak, but it's better than it was. So, okay, so we're going to have a look at getting rid of that in a minute. Another way to do it is to get a tweak board. Same principle really, it's just a nice flat surface in the shape of the chassis. You lay it down like that and do the same, just push the car down in different locations and see if there's any slight movement in the chassis. And if there is, that means there's a tweak. So, okay, so if you found some tweak, what do you do to get rid of it? So what you're trying to do is take out the stress in the top deck and the chassis so the car can naturally reset to a flat position. And there's a few different ways to do that. So the first thing to do is loosen up the top deck. So we're going to loosen these screws just a little bit, just maybe 1 or 2 turns. Okay, so I've got all the top deck screws loosened up now, so the lower deck is hopefully free to sort of reset back into a flat position. Now that doesn't always work, so there's a few other things you can do. So on this car, this is an X4, you can see these front shock mounts are separate, so there's not going to be any tweak generated from these mounts here because they're separate left and right. But if you look at the rear of the car, you can see this rear shock brace is joined left and right. So a good thing to do is, let's just loosen off these screws here on the rear shock brace, and hopefully that'll take the tweak out of the chassis. So we loosen those off. That should hopefully do the job. Right, there's one more thing you can do. If you flip the car over, if you still can't get rid of the tweak, loosen off the screws on the motor mount. So cut the screws here. And if you're still struggling, loosen the screws here, which are holding the front and rear pulleys. So we've got 4 here. Okay. Now everything should be fine now. So just, everything's loose, but if you just check, push down with the stick, just check there's no wobble. Okay, that's all looking good. Now, if you do all those things and the car's still showing some signs of tweak, then it could be that the chassis is actually bent. You know, maybe it's had a hard crash or I don't know what, but if you're still getting tweak after doing all those things, then could be bad news. It could be that the chassis is actually warped. So that's pretty drastic. I have had it in the past. You're pretty unlucky if it gets to that, but only thing to do then to know for sure is to take the whole chassis plate off, lay it on a flat surface and see. And if it's still moving then and the chassis is tweaked, then yeah, there's really nothing you can do to put that right. You know, if you want the car to be set up right, unfortunately you're going to have to get a new chassis, which will cost you a few quid. But anyway, that's pretty unusual. Hopefully these things will get rid of the tweak in the car. So after that, don't forget to tighten all the screws back up, and then we'll be ready to go on to the next step. Right, okay, so we've got rid of the tweak in the car and we've tightened up all the screws. So the next thing I want to talk about today is setting the droop. So droop is basically the amount of extra travel in the suspension arms over and above what you have at its ride height. So droop settings are really important for the balance of the car, and also you can change the droop settings to adjust the characteristics of the car to make it better balanced, more responsive, more stable, or whatever you want. But we'll go into those in another program. So for now, I'm just going to show you basically how to do the droop settings, because that's a really important thing to do first before you get into the detailed setup of the car. So a lot of people do droop setting with the shocks off. I'm going to leave them on for now, but the important thing to remember if you're doing the droop settings with the shocks on, and good to check anyway, is you need to check the shocks are all exactly the same length. So you need the travel in each of the shocks to be the same. Normally that's 9mm, and check the instructions for your car. But for these short shocks, the 9mm is fairly normal. So this is quite a good tool. You can clamp the shaft of the shock absorber in here and tighten up the ball joint, and the width of this is exactly 9mm. So you know, if you're tightening up the shocks with this, it's just right. So check all the shocks are the right size, exactly the same size. And you can see here on a setup sheet, shock length 9mm. So I've checked all those and they're all good. But what we're going to do now is do the droop settings for this car. And if you look at a setup sheet, so this is a setup sheet for my car. You can go to Petite RC and get setup sheets for pretty much any car. You can see the settings we're going to do right now are rear rear down stop, front down stop. So that's the droop settings, sorry, front and rear. So let's have a look at the rear first. So we need a setting of 4mm. Okay, so how are we going to do that? Let's get our blocks in place. So put these here like this. Chassis is nice and flat, so I don't need to worry. So I can put the car down there, and I know it's okay. Now, to measure the droop, how you do it is you're measuring to the underside of the suspension arm. So for whatever car you've got, it's the underside here that you're measuring. Sometimes when you look at this setup sheet, it's a little bit confusing, but it's always the lower point of the suspension arm. So if we take this car here, so this is Schumacher. So on this car, we would measure to the underside of this part of the suspension arm here. So just pick the lowest point, and that's your reference point, okay? Right, so, okay, so this is an MR33 droop gauge. This is one from Sky. They do the same thing. This one's more accurate, so this is actually quite a good buy. It comes with actually comes with droop blocks already. So if you buy this, you don't have to buy the separate droop blocks. They're just a bit small, but they are absolutely fine, and it all holds together quite neatly. So it's a good tool. So rear droop is 4mm. So if we get the gauge here, okay, so I can see that we need to make an adjustment here because I'm putting that under 4, and there's still a bit of movement. So let's get our wrench. We're just going to make a small adjustment here. So we're going to let the suspension arm go down because we want the bottom of this suspension arm just resting on 4. So I've gone a bit far there. There you go, that's perfect. Let's do the other side. Again, needs to come down a bit. Just so you can feel it touching. There we go, that's just right. Okay, so we've got the rear droop settings done. Let's swap it round and do the front. So on the front, we're looking at 5.6. So let's get to 5.6. So yeah, I can see I'm way over. So I need to let the arm down a little bit, so it's just rubbing on 5.6. Okay, that one's done. Let's do the other side. Always the same left and right. You never have different left setting to a right setting, but it's different front to back. Okay, that's done. So we've got the droop settings right. We've got rid of the tweak in the car. So now we're ready to go to the next stage of setup, but we'll do that in another program. Okay, thanks for watching.